Hey, Mike Zorns, also known as the Political Otter, coming to you from the Mount Pleasant neighborhood of Toronto. There are a lot of really beautiful Edwardian era buildings in this neighborhood. Makes it one of my favorite places to go for a walk. So while we're walking, let's talk a little bit more in our series of What Did Carney Really Say? This is where I'm taking some of the myths and misunderstandings from the book Values, because I've read it and listened to it on audiobook. Listen to it at 1.5 speed, by the way, if you do, so much better experience. And we're going to break down what Carney actually said. So, our focus today are the couple of chapters that are dedicated to green energy and global warming, how we're going to deal with the climate crisis. This is one of the areas of the book that has been most highly weaponized against Carney throughout the course of his campaign. So I think it's one of the areas where we're probably going to continue to see a lot of misinformation or at least half quotes being leveraged against him as he begins to move Parliament forward. So I think it's really important for us to understand what he actually said, some of the context of these chapters, and I promise to try and make it as interesting as possible because it's Mark Carney and he is really boring. So, what did he actually say? So let's start out with some of the things I like about what he says here, and we're going to follow that up with some of the things that I'm not all that crazy about. We're going to start with the context created for the discussion, and Carney goes out of his way in the early part of this discussion to reinforce one of the major themes of the book, which is that institutions, whether it's financial or government, are 100% serving at the privilege of the people. It is painfully restated multiple times throughout this discussion how it is a requirement for government, for banks, for institutions to have the consent of the people in order to enact anything that they do. The reason I bring this up is because of how much I'm seeing online people calling the Liberals and Carney a dictator. I just want to be very clear about publicly where he stands on his own power limits. I think there's a very common phrase that I love. By the way, I'm taking a little side note here. That is the person putting out the fire is usually the arsonist. And I bring this up because I think it's very true of some of the differences we've seen with Carney and Pierre Poilievre. We're seeing a lot of the word fascist, dictatorship, those sorts of words coming at Carney from the right when he's the guy who actually said the Constitution is there to protect us, the citizenry, from people like him and them, in other words, the politicians and the government, versus, Pierre Poilievre, who outright said in the French debate that yes, he would override personal liberties guaranteed by the Canadian Constitution and Charter of Rights and Freedoms and provincial authorities guaranteed by the Canadian Constitution in order to get his agenda pushed. So the reason I'm spending so much time reiterating how much Carney has put attention on that government cannot do anything unless it serves the values of the people, the will of the people. It is reiterated multiple times within this section of the book, and it's important because of the political climate that we have right now. Another big plus for me around this discussion and how Carney frames it is the time and attention that's really gone into explaining the tragedy of the commons, which is then followed up by a term that I believe he coined, which is the tragedy of the horizon, which are two complementary ideas to each other. And they really do frame up the number of biggest challenges around environmental impact and why regulation is required. So the tragedy of the commons is pretty simple to understand. When you have a common good, it's very difficult to associate a monetary value to that good. And if it's owned and used by everyone, that means it can be overused by everyone, which often leads to destruction. The typical analogy is you think of a pond, you have a small community. If you take two fish out of that pond every single day, the community can easily be fed without negatively impacting the fish population. They live, they die, they reproduce. So you have a sustainable resource. But because it's not owned by anyone, not regulated by anyone, what often happens is suddenly you start taking out more fish than you need to sustain your community. You use those extra fish to trade for other goods and services that you want. You use those to then fish more fish out of the pond, and suddenly you hit a point where you're pulling more fish out of your pond than what nature can naturally reproduce and give back. Therefore, the fish stock collapses, there are no more fish in the pond, and everything goes to heck. That is the tragedy of the commons in a nutshell. Although that is a, perfect scenario version of it, what I love about this book is how many times he goes back to real life examples where we've seen this happen. One of the biggest ones that's required some of the most substantial government regulation changes is a UK case study around grazing rights for cattle. So it's a very deep discussion of the tragedy of the commons, what it is, real life case studies of where it's been enacted well through legislation and where we've dropped the ball. I actually really liked that discussion. Tragedy of the Horizon is a very similar concept, but it's being applied to the short term goals versus long term impact. So the horizon is however far out, a generation out, let's say 100 years from now. The same problem of the tragedy of the commons can be applied across time frames. What's really good for a generation right now, exploiting a resource, is something that a future generation is going to have to pay for. So again, very great explanation of and whole framework of what the climate change challenge is. One other area I really like about this discussion, it's another really important framework, is where he goes through all of the different methodologies that can be utilized in order to assign a monetary value to the commons, whether we're talking about the tragedy of the commons, so shared environmental resources like air, water, etc., or whether we're talking about shared resources when it comes to the tragedy of the horizon. He does a deep technical explanation of all the different potential tools that can be used for measuring those, the positives and the negatives of each one, where there's been successes and failures for different governments who have utilized these. What I also found reading this and listening to this is that there is not a judgment call as to which tool is the best. You can kind of read into which ones Carney likes in particular. He happened to be the governor of the Bank of England. He happened to also be a large part of the World Economic Forum. So definitely the examples of where those institutions have implemented certain strategies, you can read into him favoring those strategies, but it's not explicitly stated. And again, he does very consciously go through where the negative aspects of those strategies have been. So again, there's a really balanced approach to the good, the bad, and the ugly of applying monetary value to common goods and trying to figure out how that impacts long-term time frames, the tragedy of the horizons. So, one more area of this book that or of these chapters that I really, really like is also the real life case studies of how climate change has impacted the insurance industry. The insurance industry has been really ahead on this. They've had to pay more when it comes to climate change than pretty much any other industry due to, once in a century weather events happening a couple times a decade, every decade for the for the past roughly 20 years. So there's a couple of really good case studies there that help us better contextualize and understand the need for a monetary value to climate change. One of my favorites is talking about Hurricane Sandy in New York and the surrounding areas. Really interesting because one of the measurable things is over the last roughly 150 years, the sea level in and around New York is 15, 20 centimeters, depending on whose science you like, higher than it had been. And the insurance estimates are that that's roughly made about a $30 billion impact on the damage that was created during Hurricane Sandy. So again, you've got some real incredible true life examples of what some of this climate impact is looking like as a great context and backdrop to the question of how do we deal with this. So next we lead into how do we actually deal with this? What does policy, what mechanisms and tools are available in order to measure, to price the impacts of climate change so that it is something that gets baked into the system and helps us move to a greener economy. Carney puts forward several theories here. One of my dislikes around this is him not explicitly saying which ones he's for. Again, there's a lot of different use of different mechanisms in order to do this. Which ones he personally favors and would want to see a country like Canada implement. Not actually clear in this book. This book was written as he was toying with the idea of doing a political run. It was written well before he intended to run to be the head of the Liberal Party of Canada and run to be the Prime Minister of Canada. So I can give a little bit of tolerance, I guess, for the fact that those aren't explicitly stated. But for me, that is one of the downsides of these chapters. So the vision for a carbon zero world that Carney lays out is definitely the strategy that is pretty much universally agreed upon by everybody who is in green tech and a promoter of green energy. Being able to reduce our reliance on carbon-based energy production means that our energy generation is coming from clean, renewable resources, really means that we can greenify almost everything else within our economy. Now, that doesn't mean that oil and natural gas go away. There is a place for them, particularly when we talk about the sort of byproduct goods of that industry. Those resources are always going to have to be a part of the economy. Let's face it, food production. We don't have food production without the natural gas economy, because a lot of the major commercial fertilizers that are used to support the farming industry for feeding the size of populations that we have throughout most of the world right now are derivatives of the natural gas industry. So natural gas is also the cleanest burning of all of the carbon fuels. And there is no doubt that as the technology stands right now, there is a huge opportunity for natural gas to be the intermediate product that helps move us from where we are today to where a future 50 to 100 years from now might be, while ensuring that our short and medium term carbon reductions are met. So there's a very fair and balanced approach here that I like. What I dislike is that the vision requires all of that to also go away and be 100% reliant on renewable resources at some point in the future, which requires technology that doesn't yet exist. There is no technology for large commercial engines. So we're talking about heavy machinery and industrial agriculture. We're talking about planes. We're talking about the sorts of transportation of goods, services, and the machinery that goes into, making food. Today, even though there's some experimentation going on around hydrogen and potentially using hydrogen engine for this type of industry, the technology to do it in a way that is safe and desirable doesn't really exist yet. And we would have to have a fundamentally new breakthrough in solar as well as in battery technology in order to greenify the energy production grid enough to even create the hydrogen for those heavy equipment engines. The reality is that creating hydrogen is pretty much the most energy intensive process that any human endeavor and any human energy creation goes through. So if we want to use hydrogen as a fuel, the amount of energy that it takes to break apart the most stable molecules known in the entirety of the universe to become hydrogen fuel, we don't have the technology to do it at a scale that makes sense where it would reduce the carbon footprint as opposed to increase the carbon footprint. So there's a couple of the ideas here that are great future visions, things that hopefully science and technology are going to get us to at some point, but hope is not a strategy. I'm much more interested in where we are today and what can we do with the current resources that we have. Where can we do green where green makes sense and there's an economically viable business case for it. So, Quebec, hydro, absolutely. Ontario, hydro and solar, absolutely. Most of the prairie provinces in Canada, wind and natural gas, ensuring that we have no coal left in our system, moving off of burning oil and going into burning biodiesels, being able to burn and utilize much cleaner carbon sources than what we do with oil. Absolutely. Oil will still be in high demand. It'll still be used. It's still going to be turned into all the other products that it gets turned into beyond fuel. So, there is a lot of good for our industries in going green where green makes sense. But the vision that's put forward relies on technology that's not there yet. For me, that's the big down of this chapter. What I don't understand from the conservatives, it's a really easy win to talk about that. Like, the vision is great. We pretty much all agree that we want to get there. And the fact that Carney is really, really clear about the fact that liquefied natural gas and oil still have a place to play in getting there and even after we get there. Those are all good. Those are all really good things. But it'd be so easy to own him on the comments that, hey, the technology for your vision isn't there yet. Why aren't you concentrating on what can be achievable today? And I don't know why the conservatives are not putting forward that simple an argument. So those are my ups and downs on what Carney actually said about environmental policy, where he stands, and his vision of what a cleaner future looks like. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and let's strike a little debate here. Thanks for watching.